Now, as you guys probably know, I like to experiment with bassline ideas. That much should be evident from my many videos on the topics, as well as my obsession to get a clean bassline. Now, in the past, I did make a video where I experimented with separating the sub-bass from your bassline. And to be honest, I don't really like what that video did. So I tried it again and I came up with a very cool new technique that I think actually works well. So here I have a little bit of an experiment project. As you can see, there are two different basslines loaded, and the first one is my standard M Sound Factory bassline. For those that have seen my production stream or my video on this particular instrument, you'll know that this is a bassline that I made. It's basically like a whole bassline instrument. You only really have the controls that you actually want to tweak here, and then all of the processing is down here. You can activate the different ones and you can even move the different ones around if needed. And I essentially made a bunch of presets for this, which is what this is. I've just loaded one of the presets, made some small modifications so that we can compare it to this other bassline right here. And this is a serum bass. Now, both of these patches have been made with the Wavetable technique. This is a technique where you take some of the processing that you normally apply to your bassline, captured it with a saw wave into a wavetable, and then use that as the starting point for the oscillator. The reason why you would do that is cleanliness. Let's have a look at Psyscope here. What you'll normally notice with a normally processed bassline with just kind of like your standard multiband processing is that each of the bass notes kind of morphs into the next one. This is called post-ringing. But if we play this here, you can see that for each of the bass notes that are in here, it's only going to play in the exact part that it needs to play, and it's actually going to stop here and make place for the next note to play. You can see that if we look in the individual layer, that there's no post-ringing here. This transient is completely fine. This transient, it looks strange now, but that's because the playback stopped there. If I stop it here, you can see it does look fine as well here. And then there's a little bit of post-ringing here, but this is not enough to be a problem for the kick. I'm actually working on a big wavetable pack that is going to encapsulate a whole bunch of different processes that you can use. I will also make a separate video on this whole idea. So if you want to see that, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel when that comes out. For now though, if we look into this waveform, you might notice something very strange here. And that is that the waveform isn't your traditional bassline where it kind of morphs over time. For those that have never looked at their own bassline with a plugin like this is called Psyscope. I highly recommend that you get it and that you actually experiment with looking at your bassline individually and seeing how it looks on the analyzer. Almost all of my experimentation when I'm experimenting with new ideas for kick and bass happened under the eye of a Psyscope. And that is because you will notice very small details like this. But as I said before, normally the bassline doesn't look like this. It is not the same waveform over and over again. And the reason for that is because we're no longer actually processing this bassline. So the phase shift can never exceed the waveform itself. It is encapsulated in the waveform that is used in the wavetable. In this case, it's this wavetable right here. That's a little bit of a mess, so let's look at it like this. You can see the phasing is already aligned in the wavetable itself. And therefore you will never have that this oscillation looks different from this oscillation and it looks different from this oscillation, apart obviously from the filter sweep going on top of it with the low pass filter. But what this means for our bassline is that it loses its dynamics. It does not have that kind of evolving elements to it, and therefore it feels very stale. Now, before we continue, I do quickly want to say, if you're new here, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and that you like the video if you enjoy it. And if you want to support me financially, you can do so by checking out my Gumroad for my products, as well as my Patreon for early access to my videos, as well as discount codes for my Gumroad. With that being said, let's get back into the video. So I decided to come up with this patch, which uses a technique to actually circumvent this from happening. Here you can see that in action. This is the waveform for the bassline. We can look at it like this as well, and you can see that this waveform evolves more over time. The reason why this happens is because we are separating the sub-bass from the rest of the waveform. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to have separate volume control over the rest of the harmonics as opposed to the sub-bass. And you can see that I'm using this idea to make the sub-bass come in later ever so slightly. Another benefit of this is that I can change the phase of the sub-bass and I can maybe morph this waveform into a shape that I like more. You can see that with the phase that we have set now, it feels a little bit less going to the side. If I move it like this, you can see that it moves down. And sometimes we have these problems with our bassline just kind of having these one spikes here, which makes them a little bit harder to mix. So this allows you to correct for that. So the way that you set this up is you just take one of your normal wavetables that you can use for your bassline. In this case, I'm using my freeform phase wavetable. Another few wavetables that I can recommend are the Sybase wavetables by MindB. They also have the same kind of feature, but I personally like my wavetable a little bit more because I actually have control over the amount of phasing, as you can see. And what I can do then is I can go into process here and then remove fundamental high pass filter. Then in oscillator B, we have set up a separate sine wave that is going to replace that sub-bass that we just removed. We've set up a separate volume modulation for it, and only the first oscillator is going through the filter. This volume modulation, I really shaped it with the idea in mind of having that kind of delayed sub-bass effect. Again, for those who have never looked at their bassline while they're processing it, this is the kind of effect that you get from normal multiband processing. Because the phase of the sub-bass can be delayed by more than 360 degrees, and therefore it just causes a delay of one cycle or one oscillation. I know this is all very, very technical, but hopefully you can understand that this is a much cleaner way of doing things. And in fact, there's another process that I'm using to clean up this bassline, which is involving this part right here. And for that, we have to go to the effects, because here, as you can see, I wanted to apply a little bit of extra EQing, which I've set up here with this EQ. And then you can see we have this X shaper here, which is controlled by this fourth LFO right here. What this does is it turns down the volume. As you can see, the shape just goes all the way to 0, which you can do by just taking this point, which at the default is right here, and just moving it all the way down. And then basically this mix becomes a volume control. The cool thing about this is that we have 1, control over the exact shape of our waveform, and 2, we have the ability to really cut off the last end here, meaning that any post-stringing that might come from this EQ, as well as this filter, is actually being taken care of by the patch itself. And as you can see, it leads to a completely clean result in that there's no actual post-stringing going into the kick or into any of the transients of the bassline. I'll also show you what happens if I remove this part. This is just because of this particular waveform. In fact, I don't even know if it's required anymore because we did change the position of the wavetable. But as you can see by this extreme example, we can shape the volume of the bassline over time here. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use this to remove any of the dynamics. As you saw before, I was experimenting a little bit with removing the dynamics. For now, I'm just going to leave it like this. So the function is just to cut off the end bit here so that we remove to 0 right before the transient hits or right before the kick plays. Now, hopefully you can see that this is a pretty interesting technique and that there's a lot to experiment with here. I want to experiment on doing this with multiple harmonics as well. The whole reason why this started is because I wanted to upgrade this bass patch here. There are some problems with the way that I made this initial patch. So I'm going to redo it and implement everything that I learned. So that's going to be the video for now. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope that you learned something from this experiment. If you did, let me know by leaving a like, and if you're new here, make sure that you're subscribed. That's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.